Hey there, Take the Masters. This is chapter 4 in our little short WordPress plugin series. In chapter 1, we covered metadata, action hooks, filters. In chapter 2, we covered shortcodes. And in our last one, chapter 3, we covered custom post types. So now in this one, we're going to be looking at one of the kind of more recent developments in the WordPress ecosystem, which is the WordPress REST API. So you're oftentimes going to have that. You're going to get a plugin or you're going to get data. A client has existing WordPress solution and they've populated with all that information, and now they want to do a mobile app where they want to make some of that information available. We're going to be looking at how to use that, also how to use that for maybe you're doing integrations like a commerce line and you need to do a delivery solution or a partnership with a delivery company that notifies you anytime something's been delivered so you can update the status on your site. So today's going to show you how to do all of that kind of stuff. We're going to be looking at how to set up REST API endpoints, how to reference them, where they are. We're going to look at the authentication, sanitization. We're going to look at some of the options that we can make available as we are doing that. Now, you can obviously do a lot more if you understand databasing, but that is a future lesson. So remember, this is part of a series. If you are not sure where it is in the series, please check the video description down below where you will find a link to the playlist. And good luck coding. Let's get into this one. Okay, so the WordPress REST API is super useful. And not only for utilizing as a way to kind of getting other applications to access different endpoints, but also so you can authenticate and set up rules on those whenever you need to communicate with third-party solutions. You also have the options of setting up something similar to Webhooks that you can listen to or other clients can post data to that you can then process on. Maybe you give them access via key to update certain pieces of information, such as the delivery status on a product or anything like that. Or maybe you just need to expose some parts of your WordPress database to an API for consumption in a mobile app or in some other solution that you are building, or maybe even to third-party providers, depending on what information you've got. So we're going to look at doing that. So let's have a quick look at how that's going to end up. So what you're looking at now is if you look at the top part of my URL, we've got the domain that we're working on, and then we've got wp-json / our plugin's name v1 docs. So I've gone ahead and created these docs that I can pass to anybody now that has this unguarded endpoint that they can look at. And I can obviously make that available anywhere I want to. And then inside of that, it says the base URL, the version of this. These are the endpoints that are available because we just, in the previous video, created our books, custom post type, and our genre taxonomies. And maybe we have some functions specifically for webhooks that we want to have third parties integrate with, and our authentication methods that we're going to accept. And we can also put rate limits on that or whatever else we want to do. We can also put in, for example, headers, our error code, so people know those are up to us. But essentially, this is what we're going to be making. If you can see with this, I've got the endpoint, what it does, and I've got the parameters that are available for passing to those endpoints. So if I now, for example, just go to another unguarded one and I go to books, I'm going to get that data back for the books. And if I go book 1, and I see there I've got 43 as one of them, and let's just say I want to do just that one, I can just pass that in and get a single one back. Okay, and then I have other endpoints that are guarded, so I can't access them directly through the browser like this. All right, so as usual, you can always get this from the code. I've just passed this in, and I've got the REST API in this one. Here is our logic. So you can also read through the comments and stuff if you pull this from the repo. Okay, so we're quickly going to look at a couple of things in this one. We're going to be looking at registering our custom API endpoints. We're going to make sure we do one for each of the kind of HTTP verbs, such as put, post, get, delete. We're going to look at handling validation. We're going to be looking at some security around that. How do we authenticate versus inauthenticate? How do we do error handling? And it's all the classic kind of good stuff. Essentially, the major kind of functions in the WordPress library that we want to utilize here are the register _rest _routes, which allows us to register our actual routes that we're going to be using. The register _rest _ field, which allows us to add additional fields like metadata on top of those default set up endpoint fields, which uses the default query system. Then we also have helpers there, like the REST _ensure response, which ensures that our response is proper JSON. REST authorization required code, which gets the authorization error code. Then REST validation request arguments and sanitize request arguments, just so we can validate and sanitize the data that we are getting. If you're new to REST, you want to understand at least the HTTP response codes that are there. Now, 200 means an OK, 201 is it's created, 400 is bad request, 401 unauthorized, 403 forbidden, 404 not found, and 500 server error. Now, the reason you want to know that is because a lot of standard developers, including others that are used to REST, they're expecting those keys to know if something's been successful or not successful. And also certain JavaScript packages kind of will utilize that as a default. I mean, if you're going to send back to 500 with a positive response, all your front end toys integrating to that's going to think you're lying. Okay, so let's quickly look at registering our first hook. So the way we're doing that is with the action hook REST underscore API init. So the moment the REST API initializes, I'm passing it to my function. And now here's the important part for you to know. So the WP-JSON is the WordPress default for the API endpoint. After that, it's really up to you. It's your naming convention. But the best practice here is, again, a unique namespace that matches yours, same as your plugin definitions, but something short and manageable. And then the version your API is in so that you don't confuse users. That is what we would refer to as the namespace. And the namespace oftentimes will represent your organization, I said, and your API version. From there on is the actual route. So inside of that namespace, what's the route? And then from there on, we pass it an array that contains our method that we're using, get or post or whatever it is, callback, HTTP. This is going to be our callback that we're going to be using down over here, our permissions. And at the moment, as you saw, a lot of those I could access directly in the browser, and that is because I'm returning true essentially for it, essentially just for the demo, so it's publicly accessible. And if you're going to use docs, you might as well do that sometimes as well. Naturally, because it's WordPress, you can write logic to customize this authentication layer. All right, and then I'm passing in some arguments in this one because you'll notice that the default way these queries run is the same way that the normal queries run for getting posts and getting post types. So that you want to almost customize when you're setting up that versus allowing yourself to kind of modify it later. So how many posts I'm passing in the arguments of, per page, pages, search, and genre. These are the options I'm going to give my user as parameters that they can search against if they want to. And I'm kind of predefining the defaults on this as well. And if I need any kind of validation on that. So all I'm doing here for validation, I'm just making sure that I'm getting a number value there, or I'm getting a string here, and so on and thus forth. It's just so I can do a little bit of sanitization. Naturally, you don't have to do that inline. You can pass this all to a function that you write as well. And you can put the parameters or the rules around that when you're setting those up. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's look at that one in action. So I get parameter is gonna receive a WP underscore REST underscore response request. And then if you're familiar with Laravel or most other PHP frameworks, you've seen this pattern everywhere. And then I'm going to use the get params on the request in order to get the values that I've passed in. So I'm passing in 4 values here: genre, search, a page, and page types. And those are the ones that I'm getting, I'm defining, and then I'm building up my query array that I'm going to be using. And I can do just a couple of little double checks because I'm essentially extending that normal query. I might as well just see if I've got the search. If so, I'm going to update the arguments of this with the search option. If I don't have them, if some of these are optional, then I might not kind of utilize them, or I can just ignore them. Same thing with genre. These are my optional fields, so only if they are there, I'm going to look for a taxonomy query. I'm going to add that in. And then once I'm ready, I can now actually execute my query. So I'm going to go new WP query, and I'm going to pass that in. Now, obviously, you can do your SQL queries or anything you did, but we'll look at that in the next video when we explore databasing. So for now, based upon what we know, these are the sample ways that you can use the existing query systems. Okay. And then that's pretty much it. We're going to execute that new query, passing in the arguments we've defined. That's going to give us the results back. And then out of that, we can get the posts, right? So standard WordPress type stuff. Again, if that doesn't make sense, if you want more detail and understanding how that master query works, let me know in the comments and we can go into it in another video. All right. Then obviously, if I don't get anything back, I'm just going to output like an error there. But assuming I did get my data back, I'm just building up a query, and then I'm going for each loop where I'm looping over the data that I got back. And again, here's the thing, because that data that's a default query. It's not by default going to be bringing me my metadata with. So I'm going to have to loop over that and get the metadata. Remember what we spoke about earlier? We said that there was the register res underscore routes, but there was also register res underscore field. Field is a way that I can kind of modify the queries to by default do these things, but we'll look at that in a bit. Right, and then I'm going to pass in the taxonomy, so I can use the WP underscore get underscore post terms. That's going to give me the terms of the taxonomies associated by what I give. In this case, I'm looking against the genres, and I'm passing in an array of field names. We get the genres, and I'm basically just looking from that. From that entire list, I just want the actual names of the fields. I don't need anything else. And I also want to get the featured image that might be linked to that book. So again, WordPress gives me a nice function for that. Get underscore the post thumbnail URL, so I can get the URL of any images that's been linked to the feature image of that. And then again, here I'm passing in the ID of what we're working with, and I am passing in the size that I want to get for that. And now here I can just bold up the data that I want to bring back, because again, you're bolding this up so you can modify this information any way you want to. So in the content, for example, I'm going to apply a filter there for the content. So if there is any other content filters available, I can fire those off. I want to convert the ID to the permalink, so I can get the permalink for that. And then I am just going to run it through the REST ensure response to make sure I've got a good response. And then added to that, I'm going to add headers to this file. So the headers I'm basically going to give it is I'm going to give it a WP total, WP pages, and I'm going to utilize the benefit because I'm using query vars. I'm basically going to be able to use the found underscore posts and the max underscore number of pages, that comes back, especially considering that I'm giving the user the ability to limit the pages inside of this query, and I'm limiting it by default as well. So that way I'm getting a better kind of response out from my user, and it's got more information that they can work with. Okay, so same thing if I want to register now again, another endpoint. Let's just say I want to get just by one single item. You get that, it's the namespace, it's my actual path, and here I'm passing in some rules, so I can just make sure that I'm getting a single kind of value there. And I'm using a get, I'm passing it to my method, I'm letting it return true, I've got no issues there. And then I'm passing in the arguments available, and I'm just doing some conditions for it. So I'm giving a description that I can use in my docs, and also I'm giving a callback that I can just handle that. And I might want to use some sanitization on that, which is available. We can look at that. We'll look at that a little bit later on. And then when I'm firing off my callback, again, from the get params, I'm getting my ID. I'm still getting in that WP res, which you want to make sure you're adding to that. Otherwise, you won't have access to this. And then I'm just checking, does that post exist by that ID? If it does, is it part of my book endpoint? And is it actually maybe set as published? Because I've got the post, I can look at all the attributes available on that to make my decision. So published, yes. So it has to be published. It has to be in books. Otherwise, I'm just going to say, no, sorry, we couldn't find it. And hence, notice I'm passing in a status of 404 for that with the error. Okay, and then again, like I did before, I'm bolding up here the additional data that I can't get because I'm not currently using register fields. And I'm bolding up my response and I'm sending that back. Now, the exact same thing if I wanted to use the genres. So same structure as I set up before. Again, namespace, URL, and then the parameters of the method callback, the permissions. I'm still doing true. We're not doing anything unique here. I can essentially pass in a callback method that's going to handle that, but we'll look at that in a bit. And then I've got an array option. I'm giving the user the ability to say hide any empties. And by default, I'm going to make that false. And this, I'm getting the query. I'm using the get terms and I'm passing an array of it. So the get terms, I'm defaulting to genre, which is the taxonomy that I've set up for this section, and the option of hide empty, which is based upon what I'm getting from the parameter fields. So do we have genres? If so, let's then come back with what those genres are. All right, so that's another way for me to just get all the taxonomies. Let's look at a little bit of validation, because now if we're going to move over to allowing the user to actually create a book, we need to be a little bit more kind of cautious. Now, we're going to up this as we go. But essentially, all I'm doing differently here is now I'm using the method of post, and I've got my callback, but I've also got a permissions callback added to it. Now, you've already seen passing parameters into it. I'll just give you a couple of examples there. We've got sanitize, callback in that, and that uses sanitized text field. And these are custom functions. So there are a couple of these that exist, but we'll look at that as we go. So essentially, if I look at my permissions one, and the permissions one, the big rule is you got to return a true or false, essentially. And the logic around that is yours. So we can check in this one, for example, is the user logged in? Maybe I'm only letting them do from an authenticated system, or I'm letting them password usernames. And does the user currently have the publish post permissions? If they don't have any of those, then we're not even going to look at them. Now, assuming all that criteria is met, then we can go ahead and create the book. Again, we're fetching the parameters. We're building up our actual array post, which will then be the way you would define an array when you're doing the posts. So post title, post content, post excerpt, post type, status, author, all the stuff I'm essentially letting my user modify. And then I'm simply calling the WP underscore insert underscore posts that, and I'm passing in a value of true. And I'm doing just a little bit of error checking on that. And then again, remember, post metadata is separate. You can't just post, that's not part of the post. That's part of the metadata married to the post. So even though I've done that, I still would have to go and check, did they pass in an author and an ISBN? And if they did, I would have to use the post ID that I got from the post insert. And then I would have to go and update that against the values that I had from before. And the exact same is true also for the taxonomies. So if I want to attach the taxonomy to that, in which case I'm passing in the genre, I want to see is that not empty. And if it's not empty, again, the post, and then inject that value into the genre's taxonomy. Okay, so I can marry essentially the term of that taxonomy to my post ID. And then when I'm done, just let's get that post back so we make sure our data is good and it's actually the ones that have saved, or maybe there's been an error and we can check it. And then I'm just taking that back in. And then some values, again, like author, ISBN, genre, permalink, these aren't going to come back as direct information. I've got to query those. So I'll use the get post meta again to get that info, and the get permalink to get the actual link. And then as before, I'm using the REST ensure response. So I get a good qualified JSON, and then I'm adding to that response a set status. So I'm setting a status of 201. And as you remember from before, that indicates that a record has been created. By the same convention, if you're going to be doing any kind of updating, you want to use the put method as the standard. So similar activity, put, we're using a different little bit of a callback permission here. We've got quite a couple of values inside of this one, because obviously things will need differently. Here is we will need the ID, for instance. So with that passed in, we're going to use the update book permissions is my little permissions check. And I want to even check here, did they send in an ID? Otherwise, if they didn't send an ID, why do I even want to bother with it? And then I can check the other levels of the permission, right? Can they get posts? Does that post even exist? Do we even find it? If so, are they just using random numbers to test things? Do they have the permissions? Are the users? And only if those passes, then I'll say true, okay? And then I'll give them the ability now to update the book. Again, check for the permission, assign that to a variable, get the post, look at this exists, let's do our sanitization. And then we can simply go through that and we can use the has param on this to actually see if that parameter we've defined does indeed exist. And if it exists, let's get the parameter and let's set it up to our data that we want to update. And when we're done, let's use the w update underscore post instead of the insert post now to update that post, which again will supply us with what we need, which again doesn't exclude us from updating our metadata immediately. That's only the main post type. So we still have to go check if everything went well, we didn't have any issues. Then we have to go over the same with each of our metadata pieces and update the post meta by again passing the ID, the meta key, and then the value that we want to do. And then finally, let's get that post and let's return it back to the user in a REST response they can actually handle and work with. Now, again, that brings us up to delete. Same thing. Just here, we're going to pass in the method of delete. And we're going to look for its own kind of unique little conditions. And I'm doing a very similar thing to what we saw here. So I'm not really going to cover too much of that. And then in my delete, the main thing I want you to be aware of here is now we're going to be using the w underscore delete underscore post value. And we're going to pass in the ID that we're deleting and the optional force. So we do have an option for force. And just what that force is if we pass the force value in on it as true, the second parameter, if that's being passed in as true, we're basically saying skip the trash. So anytime you on normal WordPress will delete a post, it goes to the trash. This skips the trash and permanently deletes it. So you do want to be aware of that. And also, you might want to just kind of like capture that data beforehand before you just completely delete it, so that you can maybe just go back to the user and say when the response like, hey, this was the actual book that you deleted is now deleted, just in case someone made a mistake and they deleted the wrong book. Because otherwise you're just saying your book's been deleted and they've got no information. They don't know what they actually deleted. Maybe they pressed the wrong button. So let's make their life a little bit less stressful, especially with something that a database serious. So the authentication layer is definitely an interesting one. And there's a lot of different authentication options that become available for us in WordPress. Now you can take the username and password. And also another option that you get is once you kind of set up a REST option or a set of REST functions like this, we'll also suddenly have is if we go to the user's actual profile, inside of the user's profile, if we scroll down, or depending on how many fields there are, we will have a new option that shows up called application passwords. Application password allows us to generate a password for the user that's at least keeps their own password safe and that can be used for for authenticating applications. So the common authentication method is obviously firstly the cookie authentication. That's for a user that's actively logged in and using the application. There's the application passwords, which I just showed you there. And that would be mostly used for external applications that need to safeguard their own password, but we can remove that if we need to. JWT tokens is still always a popular one, and that's up to yourself to kind of implement. And then API keys for server to server that you can also manage and set up yourself, especially now that you know how to create your plugin. And when we look at database, I'll show you a couple of cool methods on how you can just generate those in association to a user. Okay, so let's just look at a little bit more of the authentication layer. So now you kind of know what the bulk of this is. So let's really just focus on the authentication layer here. Again, for the standard cookie response that you've already seen, cut and dry, we just want to make sure the user here is logged in and they have the appropriate permissions, right? That's one we've done before. And then from there on, obviously, we can do what we want to. We're just giving them the post back in this little one. Now, let's just say we want to hand our user an API key to work with in their piece. Now, we want to check for that and let them pass it in their header. Well, we can then literally say the key. So, for example, we can then say to the user, put it in as the x-API-key, and then we can use the request get header in order to pull that out to validate that against. And now, for example, in this instance, this key I could have stored as a get options or set as an options in my options table that I can then reference other relationships with. So in this case, I can validate the key that I have there against what I've got in my options table, and then based upon that, either say it's valid or it's invalid. Okay, so one thing that was quite frustrating from earlier on is constantly having to put in those additional metadata fields. We can kind of remedy that with the register REST fields function. So here I've got a REST API init hook that I'm wiring into, and all I'm doing is I'm registering these REST fields. And all I'm essentially saying to that is, whenever we get a post type of this, so post type like book, I want to attach this key to it. And here's the logic for handling that. Now, the logic for handling that is the big one, because remember, we're going to have posts and updates and deletes. So we need a get callback and an update callback and something in the schema that we can define what permissions are available for it. So in my get callback, I'm simply doing my get post meta as I would have done, right? Passing in the object, the field name, and the request. So when it loops over, it finds this, it's going to know that that register field's there, and then it's going to go over and look for this to get us this information. So obviously I do get the REST information that I can utilize and the field name, and I get the request. So I know which ones come in, so I can use multiple logic in the same one. I can get the entire request object that comes in, but that could be unnecessary. But I just need the object of what I'm actually kind of getting in that array. So I'm just going to grab the ID out of that, use that on my post meta, and then just return that again as a single flat value and not as an array. And I'm really then kind of creating that same options in terms of the update callback. So when it comes down to the update callback, I essentially want to make sure that either I'm going to have a value or I'm not going to have a value in terms of that. If I'm not going to have a value, then that I can handle as a delete as an option, or I can just simply do a return and I can update the post based upon that metadata field that I've got from there. Now, just as I need to do that with the one field, I need to do that with every field that I want to make available. So if I want to do it with the ISBN, I need to do the same thing again, have a callback for get and have a callback for the update or delete kind of methodology for that. So again, no values coming in for that one, maybe a delete. Maybe want to delete it. And if there is a value attributed to it with an update call or put, then use the update post method. Now, again, looking back at my register hook, when I did these register fields, I registered 3. So I'm not limited to just things that are in the metadata. I can also go ahead and extend this in any way I want to. So obviously here I'm adding to the book type, I'm adding the book author and the book ISBN. But now maybe I want to add the view count as well. And view count doesn't necessarily exist. But I can now go ahead and do the exact same thing here. And again, I don't need to pass in an update function for it because in an example like this, I probably don't want to. So if I go over to that, all I've got going on here, of course, I've got the object. I can use that against the post metadata. And then I can add this view count. So every time there's a request for it, I'm essentially just iterating over that. But naturally, you're welcome to use existing fields or hidden fields or other options that are there or ones that are defaulted with WordPress, or you can use that for any other logic that you want to turn in on that field. The most important thing is that you return the value that you want seen in association to that and that you've registered that actual name. Okay, now in much in the same way that earlier when we were looking at creating our own custom taxonomies and post types, we were able to essentially filter and also manipulate before the query runs. We were able to kind of override that by changing the order by based upon what our options is. Now we have the same ability when it comes to the REST responses. So we could take existing REST responses either by our own or others, and we can modify that query, almost catching it and manipulating it and adding some more data to it. So for example, the way we would do that is by the REST_prepare and then the endpoint or the namespace essentially that we're going to be utilizing for that. So I'm passing in the actual post type that I want to be manipulating in here, which is my book here. And I'm passing in its call, and that's going to give me a response, a post, and a request option. I want to make sure I'm only doing this on post types that actually have my book. And again, you have the details that are going to become available to you because of the parameters being passed in. So you can use that to filter for where and when you want to do this and also your checks. That condition is up to you. So I'm going to go ahead and in the response coming back from that query, I'm going to get the data and then I'm going to add my own custom field. So in all my own custom fields, I might want to add reading time, word count, lost, updated, featured image, excerpt, formatted. And then with these, I would fire off my own additional functions, such as my own little calculation function that I've got written down here, where I'm just going to go do a word count. I'm going to strip away the tags, and I'm going to give a reading speed. I'm basically going to just determine the ceiling of that word count divided by that speeding read and give the user back a max value of what that is to give them an estimate on time, for example. So if I want to do that, that's also an option that I can also override as an alternative to using the register REST field. I can also use this to override those, but bearing in mind this is going to affect anything that has that type of query that's being run against it. I've already shown you a little bit of these, which I'm calling just webhooks in here, but that's really just so you can think about the authentication levels. Right, so you want to authenticate and logically separate differently items that might be used by a third-party application to regularly do updates to your system versus what you would do to have partners that are using applications to read and write updates, on their behalf. You may want to be doing rate limits on some. You may want to be doing, authentication against an API versus a username and password versus any of these things on the others. And you would also add your logic for referencing and checking those here. So let's just go. So for example, in this case, I have a webhook that I've set up called book updated. So anytime a book's been created or deleted or anything like that, I may want to get notified by it in some way, shape, or form. And obviously, this is going to be different from a normal user authentication. Maybe I'm going to make an API key available here. So I've got my permissions, and here I am, as we looked at earlier, passing in that, checking for the presence of that API key. And I'm going to reference, and again, this is however you've stored it. Maybe you've stored this in a database table differently. Maybe it's inside of your options table. Maybe there's a pattern you're using that you can utilize for that reference check. And I'm using this then essentially to go like, cool, do they have the API key? Is it valid? If not, reject it. But then I want to handle it. So I've got my callback. And my callback, essentially, I've got a few arguments in this one. It's an action, it's a book ID, timestamp, and a username. So if I'm going into this, I'm checking for those, and essentially I'm looking for my action, and my action is just going to be, it's been created, it's been updated, it's been deleted. Now I can fire these off even in my own application or in others. So maybe I have a point of sale system somewhere that's just firing off these details and these updates. And then based on that, I'm writing a conditional hook or conditional logic with another function. Let's just say I've got it created. I'm going to get the book ID, see if that is, get the information, maybe get some kind of stored information that I've got in the database. For example, subscribers that should know or be notified of when this change or this option happens. And then go over that list and send them all an email that says, hey, new book has been created or added to the list. I'll go and review it. So a nice way for me to kind of trigger those things out, assuming I've got that logic also written somewhere else that's actually going to call that webhook with the right action for that specific purpose. Right, and then again, I may also then utilize that to, for example, update stats. Remember earlier we had that views column for our books that we were bringing back as another field. We can use this also to go and update and increment that value as well every time a book is read or viewed or gotten. So another thing you want to be careful of is obviously if you make endpoints available, especially your public ones, it can be quite abused. So you want to make sure that you're introducing some rate limits on your piece. And we can do that by utilizing the REST_request after callback. So that allows us to implement some functionality such as a rate limiter of our own. So inside of this one, I've just got some basic logic where I'm firstly looking if the route is hitting our API or our plugin. And if it's not, then we don't care, do your thing. It's only our plugin that we're concerned about. And then maybe I want to do something like I want to log that remote server's IP address. And then I want to maybe create a key inside of my cache that I can look at later. And remember, we looked at earlier get transient as a way to kind of see a read and write cache with get transient and state transient. So I can use the exact same approach here and just like write every single time this user, his IP is kind of hitting us. And we can just see, like, is that count kind of getting to us? And we can then see, okay, cool, let's write that user's IP address to our cache. And let's then start adding a rate limit of where they are. And every time they're hitting it, let's just kind of increment that until we get to a certain count. So we're going to get the transient, then see if it does exist. If it doesn't exist, then if it doesn't exist, we're going to go define it. We'll let it last for a minute in its definition. And then we're going to set it to 1 because it's our first time. So then every time we get it again, meaning it will exist, then we can just go and increment whatever the value is for it. So this way we can then use that to check if our rate limit hits something like 100 requests per minute or anything like that, then we can use that to just send a response back to the user and say, sorry, you've reached your limit here. And a rate limit site's response is usually a 429. Alongside that, we can also then pass in some header information around the rate limit and remaining resets. And again, these are all things that we'll document inside of our documentation for our API to let the user know what parameters they check. So again, if they're writing an app, they can set and check for those variables and based upon those variables, make programmatic decisions. So another approach to caching that we can also use, especially when it comes to rate limit management, is we can use a more in-memory solution like WP cache get. So here's just a very similar response to transient, only WP cache get will work more of an in-memory or an object cache. So it's much better, obviously, if you've got something like Redis or something like that set up. So here we can just run, same as we would say set transient, we can say WP cache _ get in order to get that, and we can use WP cache _ set to set that. So when it comes to setting it, we've got 4 options, which is firstly the key, the data, and then the group that we would like to set that in. So we can actually group different keys together in a certain way, allowing ourselves to kind of delete or manage them better, making them very useful for a API. And then again, how long we want that live. Now, naturally, like your REST API is pretty basic. It's not really like its own kind of fully fledged out system because it's just an extended feature that you've got. So you might be in a situation where you need to implement cores for security purposes. And again, that you can also do by just firing it off inside of the init function, or you can do it in the init.rest function. where we can then simply do a check on the server URL to see if we're actually hitting our endpoints. And then based upon that, if we are hitting it, then we can update the headers to include any information that we need to have available inside of that headers. And then with this, we can make a pre-flight check on that to make sure that this is actually being made available on the service request. And if it's not, we can pass that out if we want to require certain headers to be available. Again, if you are going to do that, make sure that you are checking against your endpoints so that you're not necessarily affecting or blocking another endpoint for another plugin that may be using this for updating something like a WooCommerce or something like that. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to leave you with here is just document your API. So if you are going to make that available, do something like this. And again, you can pull this down from the code to get a good look at it and walk through it. I'm registering an endpoint here just for docs. And then within that, I'm just defining what endpoints are available inside of my piece, really breaking it down as a good JSON object, what authentication methods, what are my rate limit rules, what are my error codes, just so it's something simple and clean that everybody can look at and pull at any point in time. Especially when you're working with other developers, go ahead and make their life easier, or your own if you want to check back to this in another session. Anyway, I'll see you back at the desk. Okay, great stuff. I hope you learned something. And again, if you got any suggestions on things I can improve, or you got some ideas for other subjects you'd like me to go in deeper, please let me know. Also, if you yourself are looking for a mentor or partner in this space, if you're looking for a company to work with on your next big project or your next idea, hit me up. My details is down below. And if you're looking for getting involved in something more, you want to grow in this area, you want to become a one-person digital agency yourself, please do also check out the links. Have a look at my Technomancer program, which is opening at the end of 2025. So registration for access is now open, but that is launching and go live in January of 2026. So I hope to see you inside of the program. And otherwise, I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day. I'll see you in the next